ready to
We
roll.
we go on when we go on, and we're going on right now, folks. You're listening to Colexit Radio Mach 2.0. Once again, thanks so much for tuning in with us. I have a special treat for you today. Her name is Hannah Miyamoto, and she is running for lieutenant governor of all of California alongside Marcus Evans Ruiz. And here she is to tell you all about it herself, and also why and how denying statehood to Puerto Rico is actually racism. Hannah, I'll give it over to you now.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everybody out there in free California land. So, you probably haven't heard much about our campaign yet. We're running for 2022 on a anti-racist social democratic platform, and we are seeking the Democratic Party nomination. That's me, Hannah Miyamoto, and my good friend and colleague, Marcus Ruiz Evans. And if you're interested in learning more, you can find me on Facebook, Miyamoto for LG, and also Miyamoto for LG.com is the website. So, part of it, and if you're wondering why it is that we're running for office, it's a lot of complicated things, and by goodness, we've got 4 years to explain it all. But I want people to know that part of it is to be able to talk about issues like the one we're going to talk about today and explain how, if California were independent, the situation would be different and in many ways better. So today, for instance, we're talking about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, I'm sure you know, was struck by a devastating hurricane, and Donald Trump went down there and famously threw paper towels, rolled the paper towels at people who were suffering from flooding. And apparently he considered, and he's gotten himself into, he really picked a fight with the mayor of San Juan. San Juan is the largest city in Puerto Rico. We're going to talk about Puerto Rico a little bit because I think a lot of people just don't know about this island and this community, not just where it is. They probably know it's out in the Pacific, it's out in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, somewhere. But in fact, I certainly wasn't aware of exactly what a significant place that actually is, although I knew a lot about its history. And it is, of course, truly an American colony. And I use that word very advisedly. It's a colony, and the people there are deprived of rights that you and I, as members of a state, citizens of a state, have. So, what was interesting was just this week, last week I think it was, I can't remember. I think it was that there were reports that, so it wasn't like Trump himself went out and said it on live camera, but there were reports that said he was so angry with the mayor of San Juan that he would oppose statehood proposals for Puerto Rico. In other words, he feels like he can just punish an entire community of over 3 million people and thwart their views just because of his own personal feelings. So let's talk a little bit about Puerto Rico. First, it's a population of 3.6, well, that's an interesting thing. Its current population is estimated to be 3.68 million people, maybe 3.7 million people. Its population, though, is actually, as you may surprise to know, actually come down. Goodness gracious, what did it's actually fallen because of the economic, chaos. And I won't go into all the problems that Puerto Rico has economically and why their population is actually falling, but I will say that a lot of it has to do with United States policies and how they affect Puerto Rico. For instance, because Puerto Rico is part of the United States, it's a U.S. territory. It's officially called a Commonwealth, but let's call it a territory. Excuse me, I'm actually trying to find. There we go. List of territories by population. I don't know how I lost this one. Yeah, let's see. That's just it. Yeah, its 2010 population was 3.7 million people. Its current estimated population is 3.3 million, so which is unusual. A 10% loss in population in just a few years. But it's a combination of economic decline and, of course, the hurricane, which is not even considered yet, but it seems to be causing so much change in Puerto Rico that Florida's politics are now changing as well. Anyways, but that's the situation. So just one example of what I'm talking about is that because Puerto Rico is officially a U.S. territory, they're covered what's called the Jones Act, which means that any ship from a foreign country that has a cargo for Puerto Rico has to land in, believe it or not, a mainland port of the United States, and then an American ship has to take cargoes from the mainland to Puerto Rico. The same thing affects Hawaii, too, by the way. So, in other words, inefficient ships have to carry the cargoes to Puerto Rico, and literally everything that they import is imported from the mainland United States. So that's just one example of what I'm talking about, how American policies negatively affect Puerto Rico. Now, of course, there is a statehood movement. There's a Commonwealth movement. There's an independence movement, and the independence movement is definitely smaller and not that popular of an idea. But Puerto Rico seems to me is one of those places which would benefit independence. And if California were to leave the independence movement, Puerto Rico should be considered. Also, Florida should be considered a part of it. If Florida were to consider independence seriously, then obviously Puerto Rico would be right in line behind that, because it's a little bit like Hawaii. Hawaii's independence is kind of silly when everything that's shipped to Hawaii, and that literally is like 95% of their food, is coming from California ports. So, but if California were independent, then of course it almost turn things around. Hawaii almost has to become independent because it would suddenly become a U.S. territory dependent on a foreign country. So these are complicated things, but I've been one of the things so anyways, I actually tweeted, and no one responded, but I tweeted the mayor of San Juan, and because I heard this report and said, why don't you just embrace independence? We'll endorse your independence, so you endorse our independence. And seriously, that is actually something that we need to think very much about. The discussion about California independence has been so much about just California when there's a big wide world out there. And I can assure you the opinions of our neighbors and our distant friends are going to be very significant if we're really serious about independence.
I agree. There's strength in numbers, and Hillary knew this. It's why she said and kept saying we're stronger together, and what she meant was the entire U.S. She wanted everyone to be pulling together, and instead of fighting each other in this very racist way, where we've now normalized the behavior of bad cops who really put a beat down on black people just because they're black, and where neighbors of black people are just seeing black people out on the street living their lives, and they call the cops, and the cops come and immediately put the beat down on black people.
Well, actually, just realized something. We opened the question about is preventing Puerto Rico's statehood, is that racist or not? Well, like I was talking about, the population of Puerto Rico at 3.7 to 3.3 million people. Believe it or not, if it's at 3.7 million, no, 3.3. Anyways, it puts it around the 29th most populated state in the United States, if it were a state. It has, in other words, it would have more people than Iowa or Utah or Arkansas or even Nevada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, approximately one. Yeah, so I mean that's one thing. So it would be a significant state if it were a state of the union at 29. And the other thing is, of course, it's a state. Puerto Rico is also unusual in that it is actually effectively a Spanish-speaking land.
Mm-hmm.
The laws are all in Spanish. The legal system is conducted in Spanish. They have to use English in federal courts if they appeal anything, but within Puerto Rico itself, everyone is speaking Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
are the
you have to start thinking to yourself, why is it that Puerto Rico is not a state? Obviously, one would be that it'd be a heavily Democratic Party state, and it would have a lot of electoral votes for the Democrats. But I think also keeping Puerto Rico out of the United States as denying its statehood is very similar and reminiscent to me of the decades and decades in which Hawaii was not allowed to be a state, even though many states had smaller populations than Hawaii did. Hawaii, of course, did not become a state until 1959. Officially, Alaska, for some reason, Alaska was allowed to become the state before it, although effectively they were just days or weeks apart. So officially, Hawaii is the 50th state, Alaska is the 49th state, but the original proposals for Hawaii statehood actually began in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. And in that period, the number one reason why the Congress denied statehood to Hawaii, even though it had a big population and a growing one, was simply because everybody knew whites would not dominate Hawaii.
So you think that this is part of why Puerto Rico is right now being denied statehood as well, because they're the major part of their population is considered to be non-Caucasian?
Yes. I mean, if there were any reason, there's no justification. If Hawaii is supposed to be a state, then Puerto Rico should be a state.
Yes, I agree.
Hawaii is 2,500 miles from the mainland United States. I know this. I've lived there 10 years. If you want to fly in a jet, I advise you to fly out of San Francisco. It will take you 5.5 hours across the Blue Sea. Puerto Rico is actually much closer to the USA mainland than Hawaii is. And yet Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which, by the way, are very close to each other, are not states, even despite the fact that they have, Puerto Rico and, has a big population. Now, people were saying, I remember, and of course they get benefits, there's issues about taxes and all the rest, but it ultimately comes down to is Congress can make any law they want for Puerto Rico. The people there have no right to resist it because they're not a state.
Now, you've mentioned this before, Hannah, that Puerto Ricans really don't have the same rights as the rest of us here on the mainland. Can you tell us what rights you're talking about that they don't have?
Well, they don't have a ability to vote for the President of the United States. Both parties actually allow them to send delegates for nominating the President of the United States, but Puerto Rico has no representation. They have no vote for the President of the United States. They have no representation in the United States Senate. They have no representation in the United States House. Okay. And, of course, any law passed by Congress that governs Puerto Rico is the law, and they have no state government to speak of that can contradict that. Remember, the Constitution is a government of limited power. The idea is the federal government